I'm Ron Cavanaugh, Executive Director of the Literary Freedom Project. We're a nonprofit based here in the wonderful Bronx, New York. And as implied in the name, we do literary programs. This program that we're focused on this evening is One Book, One Bronx, where we invite the community. We started in person back in the good old days when we met in person. We started in person, meeting in different locations to discuss books, books that reflected our community, specifically the communities of the South Bronx, Black and Latino people. And that started in about 2014. We've kind of been up and down and all around, and now we've been consistently meeting on Zoom. Part of, forming a community is other people join your community, and hopefully that community continues to grow. A few years ago, I think it was 2016, I met Ray Pultinas. Ray is I don't want to cheat you out of your title, but I believe he's the Executive Director of the James Baldwin Outdoor Learning Center. And I think he will say a few words about his organization and himself if he likes. Ray?
All right, yeah, thanks, Ron. First of all, I'm so happy that this is our, amounts to the first JBOLC Communal Forum. And so it's a proud moment for us. We are literary, but we also focus on where food, environmental, and social justice come together. That's kind of part of the mission of our organization. And just as an ex-English teacher for 25 years, I'm just very happy to get back into my element, discussing books. I want to also, thank Ron first for hosting this. This is, I think, our third or fourth collaboration since the Mosaic Literary Conference back in maybe 2018.
So we first met in 2016, then we collaborated a few years later. I believe that was 2018.
Okay.
And then we did a program together where we read as part of the farmers market last fall.
Great.
So, and now tonight.
I'm excited and humbled by this continued partnership with Ron, and thank you so much for hosting us.
Thank you.
I'm also very honored to have Carole Weinstein as our facilitator. I think I'll just say this, that she might be one of the closest readers of James Baldwin in our presence. And I think she'll explain to you how. And I'd just like to welcome everybody else. Those of you who are a part of our garden community, and those of you who I hope will become part of our garden community. We still run a farmer's market on the corner of Goulden and Sedgwick Avenues. We're starting up again June 11th. Over the winter, we've been doing a number of pop-up events, which we've called Food and Art Collectives. And so in the spring, we hope to continue this at the market, and it'll be Food, Art, and Gardening Collective. So welcome, and thank you for participating.
Thank you, Ray. So the host for this evening is Carole Weinstein. Carole will kind of give you a little background about who she is and why she is in this place. She's an educator, scholar. Are you an official James Baldwin scholar, Carole?
No.
Okay.
I don't use
All right.
that. No.
I didn't want to burden you with too much of a title there. But she is connected to James Baldwin, and she'll sort of expose and tell us how she is. We were talking earlier, and I had admitted that I had not read this book in 30 years. I believe it was like 92. I just moved out of my parents' home. I don't know why that is so clear in my head, but I was living in a little studio in the Bronx, and it was just me in another country and my mattress. So maybe that's why I remember it so clearly. But we were just talking about the issues that James Baldwin touched on in this book. Actually 60 years ago, feels so salient now. I mean, in that book, he's talking about interracial relationships, queer relationships. And when I read it 30 years ago, it felt ahead of its time. And now it feels like society is starting to catch up with James Baldwin, that it is not unusual to be in interracial relationships. It is not unusual. It is actually now legal to be in a queer relationship, and how society has changed over the years, just for those two things that we take for granted. The book is so much more than that, but there are threads that sort of go through the book that focus on those themes. So I just want to introduce Carole. She will be leading, facilitating the conversation this evening. From time to time, I will put information in the chat about next week, about our different organizations, so on and so forth. So thank you all for coming this evening. We may have a chance near the end to introduce each of ourselves, because what we want more than anything is to build a community. So Carole, do you want to get things started?
Well, thank you very much, Ron, and thank you very much, Ray, and thank you all for being here and taking the time to do it. I know many of you are probably, I hate to use this word, zoomed out from goodness knows how many Zoom experiences and being in your local spaces because of all the obvious that has been happening. So I really appreciate all of you for doing this and for caring about his work and wanting to continue the conversation. But before I get into it much, I wanted to ask you all if you wouldn't mind sharing, because I've had an extensively long career. I am very proud to tell my age, contrary to a lot of people. So I'm 81 years old, and I started student teaching way back in the early 60s, and then officially started teaching in Harlem in 1965. And then I went to work in the poverty programs when we were trying to bring community control to the schools in New York City, and the infamous strike of 1968. I actually protested the strike with a whole bunch of folks at Benjamin Franklin High School because we wanted it to happen, and it never did, and it still hasn't, and they're still arguing about it now. So what does that say for the potential for change? I don't know, but it's very frustrating for me as a result. I then moved my career along to become an educator in colleges, community colleges, then full-time 4-year colleges, and then finally graduate schools and the professional business world. So I've had an opportunity to work across all the worlds of work as well as education. And what I think that has done is made me become much more critical, much more curmudgeon-like about what I think is possible, and much more concerned with the lack of reading that a lot of people don't do. And that includes more precisely the things that saved my life, which were books. And that's the reason why I'm happier to be here in particular. So the first question, though, that I wanted to throw out to you before we get into Another Country is, why do you think, why do you want to read this book now? And why do you think Jimmy matters? And anybody who wants to take that, or, I mean, I could call on you, but I prefer you to volunteer a few thoughts to get us going from your perspective.
And let me just add a couple of housekeeping things. You can, I mean, we appreciate you raising your hand, absolutely. But if no one is, if you're not going to talk over anyone, you can just, jump into the conversation. You don't have to raise your hand and wait for us to call on you. But again, we do appreciate, just taking that time to raise your hand, but it's not necessary.
Okay, well, I'll jump in then because I raised my hand.
Thank you.
Please do.
My name is Alexis. I actually realized that I have a lot of books. I have about 700 books in my library, and I've only read about 20% of them. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to figure out why I had so many books and haven't read them, and haven't really been making time. But I've realized that, one, I'm not really, traveling as much. So, I used to read on the train to work. So when I saw that this book, I've always wanted to do the book club, but I just never had the time, but I have the time now. So I just thought that this would be a really interesting read, and it wasn't at all what I expected. And I'm like, oh, now I'm excited to talk with y'all because there's a lot of feelings that came up while reading this book. So I'm happy to, bond with everybody in celebrating him, but also discussing the really nuanced discussions that came up in the book.
So what do you think, Alexis, he's so important now?
I mean, everybody wants to give flowers when people are dead, but don't give them when people are alive. I feel like some people really just want to sound like they're woke. I don't think that they really understand what James Baldwin believed and the things that he represented. I feel like a lot of people are just, saying it because they don't want to say the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
But, that's just me. That's just how I feel about it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Sung.
I wanted to, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. She said raise her hand. So I was good. Go ahead.
I wanted, I'm Saida. Hi, everybody. I joined this book club or this session because I actually did my thesis on Another Country, and I did it with I was comparing Another Country with Native Son, right? And James Baldwin, I was actually brought to James Baldwin by Donald Goines. So, it was, by reading Donald Goines and then, moving forward with James Baldwin, you see all of these these connections with home, the ghetto, right? Mm-hmm. That Black protagonist, that troubled Black protagonist. And Rufus is such a profound character, and he has the shortest time in the book, but he resonates throughout. So every time I read this book, you just see something new. You pay attention to something new. You find out something new. And I've been reading this book off and on for about 20 years now. So at anything James Baldwin, I have to see what's going on, because you just have to, it's James Baldwin, why not?
Well, I just want to comment on what you just shared with us, which is incredibly rich and wonderful, and thank you. Where did you do your work that got you engaged?
I did my thesis at Queens College in Flushing, and I teach the African American experience at Hostos. So that's my connection to the Bronx, but I actually live in Far Rockaway, Queens.
Oh, okay. All right. So you're in various countries.
Pretty much. I'm very far away from the Bronx right now.
Okay, thank you. Some other people's thoughts?
Yeah, I can go. Actually, I was not thinking about joining this book club, but Ray, my husband, kind of approached me too. At first, I was not interested in keep reading, but when I kept reading, it got very interesting and kind of unusual, like a plot. And so I'm really into reading it. I almost read to the 179. And a few years ago, I read another book by James Baldwin, which I really enjoyed reading. If Wall Street Could Talk. And James Baldwin became one of my favorite writers. I mean, to be honest, his plot is not really tight, but I love the way he ending his story, kind of a very uplifting, spiritual, and I see his insight and wisdom in many places. So that I really appreciate while I'm reading his books.
Thank you. Few others?
Carolina?
Hi, my name is Carolina, and sometimes it's Carolina. It depends because
I
there's
apologize.
okay, no problem. I'm new to James Baldwin. So I'm a PhD student and that I'm 42 years old. And the first time that I read James Baldwin was last semester in an African-American literature class, and we read The Fire Next Time. And I was I don't know why we never read James Baldwin sooner, or why I didn't approach his work sooner. So I went and checked out the book for this particular get together, because I do want to dive more into his work. Now, this is purely personal. It's not for my dissertation or anything like that. In The Fire Next Time, I think it's very appropriate to read James Baldwin now. He's timeless. He says they are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. And so this quote has struck me deeply because I'm a Mexican American studies advocate, and I am currently in Texas. And so the censorship here with Governor Greg Abbott has been absolutely disgusting. And so we are a part of the generations where our history was not told to us as Mexican Americans, Indigenous folks. So yeah, there's so many layers that James Baldwin brings, and I'm glad to be here and to learn and just to share space with you all. But yeah, I'm not writing about this at all. This is strictly for myself and for sharing with friends, of course.
Thank you so much. Other thoughts? Yep. Nope.
Okay.
Marissa, go ahead.
I'm sorry,
Okay,
Marissa.
so I remember I heard a little bit about Baldwin's history, and when I started reading the book, like other people said, I was kind of like shocked because it was not what I thought. It's not. I don't think he's talking about his life at all. It's a fiction, I realize. But he's trying to so I thought that was a contradiction to his character. But then I realized maybe he's trying to trying to be relatable and try to be timeless too by writing a book so that people could go back and read too, even if, because you know, a book you could read anytime you want. It doesn't matter like when it was created or anything like that. It's a story that can be told. But I think he made it, the characters, relatable so that more people could I'm not too sure about that. I'm trying to figure that out.
Well, I think it's great that you're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
And all of this is a journey. And the only way you're going to figure it out is to read it and think about it and reflect on it and so on. But the reality is, from my perspective, there is no such thing as fiction. Fiction is all based on someone's reality. I have a very biased view about that. So I think what we do with our lives, or what we do with how we interpret our lives, has everything to do with the reality of the world we're writing and living in. And at the time that we're doing it, depending on what categories people want to throw us into, then it comes out differently. So in the case of this particular book, it's officially called a novel, whatever that really means, but it's also been called a psychological and a philosophical novel. It's been called a whole lot of other things as well. And to your point, is it really not about his life? The reality is it's very much about his life. His life is resonant throughout the entire book on so many levels. Not only that he grew up in Harlem, not only that he lived a life across all kinds of lines and boundaries, but also because he was trying to bring forward how a whole lot of people coming together clash and conflict and try to figure out their own lives and their own identities in this place that we call the United States in particular, as well as across borders. So, you raised some very interesting, deep thoughts in what you just said, and we will build more on that as we move forward. Any other thoughts about the initial question? Why do you want to read this now, and why do you think his work is so resonant and prevalent? From anyone else?
I'm Jazzy. I've actually been coming to the book club on and off the last few years pre-COVID, so it's cool to be back. Hey, Ron.
Hey.
I kind of just saw this as in a newsletter, and I was like, oh, I want to check this out, and I want to be in community with other folks. So it kind of rolled out into that initially, and I have been hearing so much about his work, and I've been on and off and trying to read his books. But the last book I read was Giovanni's Room, and while there was parts where I wasn't really understanding because of the way he writes, I was so enthralled in how he just describes these places, these relationships, these connections, and how it's so relevant at that time. And when you read it now, it's still kind of relevant, even the way he's describing things, that there's still that tension between interracial relationships or classism. It may be a little different in location, but some of that stuff is still happening till this day. And in some parts of the country right now, man, it's just being yourself and being open and being loving to a same-sex partner or anything right now is all being questioned. And I just love the way that he writes. I was confused in the beginning, so I was so thoroughly grateful that the book club is here, because I got confused on how he was writing and describing things. So I get to really learn from all of you and to see like how he the perspective that he's writing in. So yeah, I'm here for community, but also I just started reading a book too, so.
Thank you. Can I just interject a little bit? One of the for the new people here, one of the reasons we started this discussion group is just to follow up on what Jazzy and Marissa said. Sometimes you need help with a book. Like you understand the importance of the author. You know that the subject matter is important and really necessary to the life you want to lead and live, or even if you just want to be entertained by that author. Sometimes you need a group. You need a support system to sort of help you and help myself make it through a lot of books. People think that I sit and read everything all the time, and I don't. And I need help with Octavia Butler, you know? So this group, we've read her once, but you know, I need as much help as anyone else, because in this community, we're all equal. You know, we may come from different places, and I think someone is from Texas. Hey, Carolina. We've had people as far as South Africa join us. You know, they have the same questions in South Africa that we have here in the Bronx. And if we can, you know, sort of establish a firm community, then we can really kind of assist each other through all of these different texts.
For sure. Any other initial thoughts, comments? Okay, I'm going to throw out a couple of reflections. I spoke to several friends of mine. I dug a little deeper into why I think his work is resonating the way it's resonating. And what several of them said was, initially, they see him as prophetic. Now, whatever the word prophetic means to you can be quite different depending on your feelings about whether you associate prophet with religion, or whether you associate prophet with a seer, an educator, or whatever. But in general, that word is very commonly used lately, and probably the last decade in particular. So some people said they love to read him because he writes about life patterns and the hidden secrets of facing all of our tendencies and temptations. Another person said they thought he was able to love all people globally across all categories and lines and ways of living. Some of you have brought that out already in the examples that you have related to. He himself had said over and over and over, he wanted to be simply a good writer. He wanted to journey through his life to write and to learn about who he was through the process of writing. But during the course of doing that, he had to do it in a humane way. And he wanted to be a model for people as a moral human being. He actually read the entire County Cullen Library, according to him. And that was the library, for those of you who don't know, at the Schomburg now, it was the small version named after County Cullen. And then, of course, the Schomburg sprang out of all of that. But he used to go to the library and read everything imaginable in every category, in every way. And that's why he became so insightful and articulate about how he could write anything and also talk about it in the same way. He could take it in, he could digest it, and then he could put out his own versions of it. But it was always a painful process. He never thought writing was simple. He thought it was very, very difficult. He was very courageous to take a lot of risks. He was seeing the crossing of lines and meeting people around the globe as necessary to live his life. So therefore, he traveled the globe a lot, and his was always focused on individual freedom and making friends to help him do that. He was very fixated on light and darkness, and he learned that a lot from a lot of people call Buford Delaney as his mentor, but Buford was more of a, he was a mentor in a sense, but he was also a man who was, and now is finally getting his due across the world as an extraordinary artist and painter and creator of all kind of creative visual imagery in particular. But it took him a whole lot of years to get there himself. And he came from Tennessee, but he lived in New York City when Jimmy met him. And he met him when he was still at DeWitt Clinton. through a friend who brought him to his apartment on Green Street in the Village. But he always credits his ability to understand how to look at things, how to see the light and darkness in things, and the color as well. He was very able to figure out how to reflect on his own roots, which is what Marissa was referring to in terms of this book, not about him, but yes, it was, because he speaks and wrote a lot about Harlem. He wrote about the entire neighborhoods he lived in, which include the parts in this entire novel. He was able to be very fixed, and this is really critical. He did not want to become hateful. And the reason he left New York in 1948 was because he was afraid he was going to kill someone because of an incident that he went through in Princeton, New Jersey, in particular, that put it in his face. And he decided he had to leave to go and figure out his life. And he took the risk of going to Paris because he was enabled with some help to do that. He was also very much aware of focusing on not becoming famous, iconic, and idle. He wanted to be a good writer, live a humble, moral life. And that comes out in everything he wrote. And one of the most important things I think it's important to realize about his work is the range of the work. He created plays, he created poetry, he wrote novels, he wrote essays, he was a journalist as well. He wrote critiques. So there is almost no category to put him in within the genre of being a writer, which is quite extraordinary. And to be able to do that all extraordinarily well requires constant work, constant reading, constant reflecting, and that's exactly what he loved to do. And he was a giver in the world, not a taker. And I think that's really very, very important. And I think he wanted more than anything to be loved and appreciated, but not in the way that the superficial world does with people. And as a result of that, there is not a lot of stuff that he got until quite late in his life in terms of awards, because he wasn't out there to do that. He wasn't out there to just make money. He wasn't out there. If anything, he lavishly and too freely spent whatever money he got, which made life for him rather challenging in many respects. So in a general sense, I just wanted you to think about the way the world sees him in more precise terms, and for what on a personal level. Because the things I just reflected on are in fact what I know he was like. I also would like,
Carole, can I interject one
Yep.
thing?
Yeah.
Just on what you just said, because a lot of times people are struck that James Baldwin, in the technical sense, was not a scholar. He graduated from DeWitt Clinton High School here in the Bronx. We claim, by the way, as a Bronx person, I claim James Baldwin.
Yes.
So
even though he grew up in Harlem.
I can fight the Harlem folks later, but his first writing experiences started in the Bronx, writing for the high school newspaper, the
Yes,
Magpie.
the
So
Magpie, right.
we claim James Baldwin.
Yes.
But in the traditional sense, he wasn't a scholar. I mean, he definitely was a scholar, but he did not go to college, or he did not have a higher degree in education, which a lot of people don't know. And like his intelligence, he built himself, you know, by going to libraries and reading and knowing, you know, different artists and people who would connect him to the information that he desired.
Thank you for bringing all that in, and that is so accurate. Yeah, he graduated from the high school at DeWitt Clinton, and that was it. Everything else he created for himself, everything else he searched out, everything else he was courageous enough to try. And that meant he had to go around and get to know an awful lot of people. And that's why a lot of this book in particular really does reflect a lot of the things he went through and that he saw. And you see it a lot extraordinarily throughout the book in the way he describes the people in the different neighborhoods, their interactions with each other. I personally came to this book in 1962. While I had never read him until then. I was in the hospital recovering from spinal surgery. At the time, I was trying to be a dancer. I had left Brooklyn College, where I had started my college education, because I never had any money. So I had to go to the freest place possible. And I left school to dance. I was hanging out with a whole lot of folks in the East Village in those days, and ended up moving there and living there, in fact, in 1960 for 5 years. But when I read this book in 62, it got me through that experience. And even though it is filled with despair and incredibly sad things that happen to all the characters in different ways, it opened up a world for me that I had no idea about on a lot of levels, and it changed my entire life, actually. So that is why I have always loved this novel, because on a personal level, it was a gift brought to me by a friend's mother, and it was the year the book was published. He actually finished the book. It says so, I think, in the book somewhere, and on December 10th, 1961. And he finished it in Istanbul, Turkey. And he had gone to Istanbul. He was on his way somewhere else to finish a journal assignment for, I forget, it was a magazine or some assignment he had. And he was exhausted. He was in despair. And this book was killing him, because it took him longer to write this book than any other book he'd written. And he was fed up with it. He technically has always said that he started it in 48 when he went to Paris, but it took him that long to finish it. So that's interesting too. And what does that reflect about what he was going through to finish this book? And it focused on the life of all the folks in it who represented a lot of people he actually knew. And that is, again, why I say this is far from fiction. And one of the lines that I put in the description of this book is this one: "Beneath them Rufus walked, one of the fallen, for the weight of the city was murderous." To me, that line is a warning. And then, of course, Rufus jumps off the bridge. But to me, it also represented the level of despair and dejection and giving up, basically, at that point, which takes Rufus where it takes Rufus. And the other key factor here that I'd like you to think about as we continue is he was interested in what I call, and a lot of people call, finding the truth. He was interested in trying to figure out, how do you determine, how do you define what truth is for you, for other people, for the world in which you live? And that is a really critically important point now, everywhere. All you have to do is listen to everybody talking about what's going on and telling the truth, the phrase of the truth, the concept of, and again, another quote, "I think you've got to be truthful about the life you have. Otherwise, there's no possibility of achieving the life you want. So here's my next question. How does book one dig into how and whether we see truth? Whose truth? Yours, mine, ours. How does that relate to honesty and to self-preservation? How did the characters collide and align in relationship to each other's truths, alienation, and the societies? Anyone want to? Go ahead, Ray.
I'm going to go back to the first question first,
Go
which
right
is
ahead.
why we read James Baldwin. And after listening to, I guess, and by the way, I taught at DeWitt Clinton for 25 years. I was an English teacher, and I taught. I actually started at DeWitt Clinton in 1992, which was the year that David Leeming's biography of James Baldwin was published.
Mm-hmm.
And when I kind of investigated, the status of teaching James Baldwin at DeWitt Clinton in 1992, well, it wasn't happening. Most of his books at that time they had been taught in the 70s, but then by the 90s, he had kind of fallen out of flavor, I think. And but after reading the biography, and it was written by my professor, actually, at UConn, David Leeming, so here's another connection. I realized that, James Baldwin has to be taught, and, students have to be aware of it. And so getting back to your first question is, why do we want to read James Baldwin? Well, I kind of want to propose that reading is a kind of, for lack of a better term, participatory magic, in that, I want to read James Baldwin because I want to embrace all those values that Carole and everybody has been talking about. The courageousness, I want to be courageous. I want to cross lines. I want to, talk about human responsibility, or be a responsible human being, or a good writer, or a good person. I think, I want to, and having, explored James Baldwin's works and taught electives at DeWitt Clinton on James Baldwin for many years, I know that as I get into a novel like this, that somehow magically, some of that will take part in me, that I will, earn some kind of understanding or insight, by exploring his characters. But I want to then get to the second question, which, and one of the things I've realized as I'm reading up until I have in the book is the the network of relations between the characters is so, I guess, so beautifully intricate and complex, and it reminds us, or reminds me, that we also, our perspective is always shaped by the complexity of relations that are in our own lives. We're always, some of our decisions, some of our choices really, I don't always know if I'm making them, or if I'm making them in the context of my relationship with other people, and which is fine. It's kind of, because I think, that's what community really is all about, and an acceptance of our interrelatedness, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But that's, what I've been discovering or rediscovering reading this book up until now.
Well, thank you for all of that. Anyone have any comments, insights? Joanne?
Yes. Thank you, Carol. And I want to go back to your aspect too, again, in terms of truth and this aspect of being a prophet, because people think of prophets as these prognosticators, but they're really truth tellers. And in this story, the kind of examination that he kind of use these characters to become a catalyst for, in terms of examining and reflecting on oneself, as well as the kinds of stories and interactions going on between the characters within the stories. Especially as, I look at Rufus here, it's really about truth telling as to whether or not you can really face and tell the truth about yourself, as well as that of the other people that you have in your life. And I think that, again, going back to this question of why Baldwin is relevant today, is in this era where you hear about alternative facts and my truth and everything else, here is someone, in the way he has written these characters and tells stories, he has this aspect of kind of like universal truth. Around about the human condition and about this country that we live in and about our history and things that are going on. And I think there is kind of people want to get away from that. They want to create it into some sort of truth that they feel comfortable with. And he lets us understand that truth is not always comforting, but it will set you free if you can face it.
Wow. Yes.
I kind of agree with that. I'm still figuring out in my head. I'm thinking, because I've read other books by like similar kind of genre, and it seems like they write in a third person about themselves. And I forgot the imagery, I forgot the name of the book, but I remember when I started reading this book, there's like a phrase about pissing against the wall or holding pissin. And it reminded me of a book of a family member, like a male, pissing on the roots of a tree, and something about giving someone plastic flowers, or like.
You muted yourself, Marissa.
Sorry, I'm pressing the space bar, but what is it? The fake flowers that they made, and that they would give each other nothing real. It's a lot of bitterness and like difficulty finding true love or something like that, and figuring that out. That's how it seems like. I think that's some kind of truth, but I feel like when I said he was fake, I feel like it's not relating to him, because I wouldn't expect him. He doesn't sound like he's gay, so that sounds kind of different. And then I'm not sure the people he interacts with, like the woman. There's certain things too when he interacted with the woman. I thought it was truthful that he thought like he just wanted to like be with her for one night, even though she just told him like, she just came out of a divorce and stuff and she's messed up. So I think there's some truth in that. I think it's relatable feelings, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think, again, I haven't read the book in 30 years, but as you read on, Marissa, you'll see like there's a fluidity of sexuality that we often talk about today, but James Baldwin was writing about it, at least 30 years ago, if not more than that. So stick with the book, and you'll realize just how prescient James Baldwin was, if that's the right pronunciation of that word. And reflecting a lot of what I'll call issues and quotes that we discussed today.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But yeah, going back though with James, with the character though, I just also want to add one more thing. I understand too that they said Rufus, the character, he's an educated man, and I also think he's a very religious man too. So he is educated, he is well influenced, he's able to talk to people from different cultures and stuff like that. So I think that's one point I will also say too.
And just as some more background, James Baldwin was raised in a religious household. I believe his father was a preacher, and he was a child ordained minister, if I'm not mistaken, Carol.
Pentecostal, yeah, but it was a
Right,
different
so
church than his
He was
father.
also, James Baldwin was also brought up in the church.
Well, he was brought up in the church as his father was a Pentecostal minister, but he became a child preacher when he was 14 for 2 years. But then he also went away from the church over the years for all kinds of reasons that we won't get into right now. But in particular, it became a place for him at the time for protecting him, for giving him his forum. And in a way, he has acknowledged that as influencing his ability to write and deal with language. So the influence it had on his ability to communicate with the world was pretty enhanced by his becoming a preacher in those couple of years. And it really did him well when he became a teacher himself later in his life, at the end of his life, when he was teaching at Amherst College and other schools as well. And he probably would have continued teaching if he hadn't died in 1987, because that was a joy for him. It made him incredibly happy, and he was able to feel that he could have some degree of opening up the minds of young people, which he cared greatly about. He was also very much a family man, cared about his family more than anyone else in the world, including himself. And he showed that in zillions of ways throughout his entire life. So all of that had influenced him and did make a difference. But again, it was a self-teaching, a self-learning, and it was done through his ability to recognize the importance of reading and learning and figuring out, how do I develop my mind without any kind of formal education? But then he came back and became somewhat of a sort of informal educator for a while. And so it's rather extraordinary that he was able to create what he created, given especially that he did it on his own. Anyone else want to have any comments or thoughts so far?
I wanted to jump in to say that I felt like the tenderness, or I guess the intimate relationships between men in this book was more realistic and phenomenal. And that secret language, which I was talking about before, that folks, particularly women, don't necessarily see, was profound for me, and actually was more realistic than the points in which he had his characters speak in types of anger towards women or female identified characters, like that. Like, it actually felt like it pained him to write that. Like, that's how it felt to me. Like, it wasn't authentic at all. Like, he didn't want to do that, but that was something that he heard or knew that men did. And to say, like, but then to come back into their minds to be like, I didn't really want to say that to her, but I needed her to be as distant as possible. Like, just and the violence that men feel. Like there was a part where he was in the bar and he went to the bathroom, and there were these he talked about his disgust with his penis. And it's interesting because like, I don't know if anybody else noticed that, but he was always talking about, it was like an obsessive like appearance of phallic symbols or conversations about penises in this whole like first part, particularly with Rufus, and like him feeling ashamed or like because he was a man, and like trying to like reassert his humanity by like being violent towards women, was what like how I saw it. So like it was just really interesting, like how men interacted in this role, and how women were kind of there on the wall to be like I guess to activate the men so that they can feel like men, but they were already like men before that. They didn't need women to kind of be men in there, but the society's understanding of what being a man meant is what they were acting out, even though when they were in private, they weren't like that at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've hit on so much there. We could go on for, I don't know, years talking about that. But I want to say two things quickly and then hear anything else people want to share. You were spot on about all that. The language was very precisely chosen. I think incredibly tender, to use the word you used, as well as sensitive, as well as insightful, as well as digging deeply down into how people feel. And there are so many sections in this first book that talk about the concepts of how men see men, how women see women, how women see men, vice versa, and the conversations back and forth among the characters. And that goes for Richard and Cass, as well as Vivaldo and Ida and Rufus and Vivaldo. And the more you look at the detail in which he narrates the specific interactions they all have, and then the insights that he throws in the different sections, you begin to realize exactly what you just said, that he is trying to figure it all out. He's trying to figure out how real each of them are being with each other, and or could be with each other, and or haven't been with themselves first. And that is exactly why this is such a, I think, a despairing beginning of the book, certainly, but appropriate to the world in which he's created here, that reflected much of the world he was living and existing in. And I knew that world myself because I was born in 40. This book takes place in the 50s. Technically, I lived more of that in the 60s. But I remember seeing those streets. I remember all those experiences and going through all those kind of challenges with getting to know people, figuring out your own sexuality, figuring out what kind of a life you want to live, but at the same time, how do you make a living and exist and be a person you want to be. And that's part of why this book is so powerful, I think, is because it explores the concepts of how do we become who we become. And, you said the thing earlier that really triggered my thinking further too, which is really, really important, is home. The concept of finding home. There's a very famous quote, and I'm going to mess it up a little bit right now because I don't want to take the time to find it here, but home is a condition, is what he wrote. Home is not a place. It may be a place temporarily, but it's really a condition. And if home isn't what you make for yourself, and again, another brilliant quote is, the place will not exist until I make it, is another line that he wrote. in effect, he understood you got to figure it all out. You know, it's not simple. And if we're not going to be real with ourselves, we can't be real with other people. And we have to be that real where we take everything about ourselves, including our sexuality, and we have to dig in deeply to see what exactly is moral, what is immoral, how do we behave with each other, you know, and so I think the exploration of all of our traumatic selves is played out in this book in so many ways. Any other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
I think, Carol, you were asking about kind of a truth. I mean, it brings me like in my personal life, when I was young, I was really big on finding the truth. And at this point, I'm 54, I get to think like, is really there's any absolute truth? I am quite doubtful, but at the same time, I think there's a danger when somebody declare this is truth, and they have a tendency, I think, not to listen to other people's truth because they think their truth is truth. I think that's a real danger. And when I lost my close friend, I kind of really realized that what's most important is more compassion and kindness than truth. Sharing my life.
Yeah. So it hits on all these very sensitive, deep experiences that we have with each other, and we have to think about what do they mean for us personally and not judgmentally. And you know, when you think about the interactions in the whole group of chapters in book one, I think you get to see among the relationships of the characters how he is trying to convey how they are being initially so careful and scared of each other and trying to break through the fears. And then when they start to break, those fears break down and they start to open up and they challenge each other, their relationships shift, they change, but then they get into a whole different way of dealing with each other because they push each other to do that, right? Did anybody have any thoughts about how that happens among the characters in the book, or anything you want to share about what you think about the characters in this? You know, the opening quote, I wanted to make sure I commented on. The opening quote in this is by Henry James. And let me just read it for a minute. They strike on above all as giving an account of themselves in any terms already consecrated by human use. To this inarticulate state, they probably form collectively the most unprecedented of monuments, abysmal the mystery of what they think, what they feel, what they want, what they suppose themselves to be saying. Now, he considered James as an inspiration for him. He was the writer that he often referred to as inspiring him, because James, although he was British, he was born in New York and he traveled the world and lived globally and wrote about it. And the kind of things he wrote about and how people didn't deal or dealt with the contradictions of their lives intrigued him. So this quote that he puts at the very front really sets up, before you even get into the book, what he's going to do in book one. At least it does for me as a result of it. And as a result, I think it made him understand how he has to play this out differently in the way in which he's going to write about it. Let's consider also the actual descriptions of what he's doing in the book a bit. So if you look, if you consider, go back to what you can remember, the description of Rufus as he's going on his walk. He describes the movie house on 42nd Street. Now, I used to go to those a lot. And especially in 1964. And it was a place where we used to go and we used to cool out after all kinds of days and crazy life that we lived. And I could relate to the way he describes the place and the ugliness of it, and yet the freedom of it, because anybody could do anything in there and nobody bothered you. And it was a dark space. So I kind of think it was a great idea to do that in terms of his first descriptions. And then he goes into the jazz blues clubs, which I personally relate to because I'm a major jazz lover and spent a lot of my life in them and still love the music is my music. So I can relate to how it feels, how it provides a kind of background, how it opens up the possibility for figuring out yourself in relationship to the music. And one of the things that I love that we did last week with the opening Using Strange Fruit, the movie documentary was, and we talked about it, how the music and the movements are so critically linked and connected, and how important they are in how we survive, how we get through our lives, and how we manage to figure out how we can relate to each other differently. But when you take all of the descriptions of how all the people he meets, and then he describes things like people show their teeth and smile at you. I mean, just get that picture, you know, phony smiling teeth. The concept that he uses between a few of the characters, and they call each other white bastards. The things that Electra was talking about that were written on the walls in the bathroom. How does all of that bring out the pain, the depth, the challenges, and as Sung said, the choices we make about how do we live our lives? How does the picture of Leona from the South, Cass from the North, and Vivaldo, the white Italian-American guy who spends a hell of a lot of his time going to Harlem, all collide in a way that makes us understand, how do we make this place the place that I need to call home? And I found the quote I was looking for. Perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable condition. And how is that another country? What does this title mean? Joanne?
Again, I was just getting ready to say something. I haven't gotten completely through Easy Rider yet, but one of the things I felt was the empathy he was helping us to understand or have for the characters, Rufus in particular, at the same time, maybe some revulsion as well too, because of the conflicts that they have within themselves. And I just think that in his writing, and one of the phrases I remember was it bloodless people don't bleed, something that he said in this as well too, that he has a real empathy for the human condition, which is messy and horrible and creates all kinds of things internally as well as externally in life, so that in different ways you live in another country. Like when he talked about his travels and bringing his sister, Ida, all these different things, and that he could see that she could have been a monarch, had lived as some kind of other life other than the one that the streets and the neighborhood was consigning to her as, just another, whore or whatever on the street, the way women were looked at in so many ways. And even the way, when people looked at him and he looked at himself being down on his luck when he started at, in contrast to where he was before when he was riding a little bit higher, playing in the bands. So I think he really is trying to get us to have a deeper understanding of ourselves and other people as human beings, even while we struggle, with that as well in ourselves and with other people too. And so it's that aspect of empathy that I saw through all that.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts?
I like that you also mentioned about the different settings that he brought himself in, because I think that is true. So I talked about he starts off very bitter, but then he goes into these environments like the jazz club or like a movie theater, which are like dark places. And you think dark places are probably bad. That's why I kind of feel like maybe he's making a religious reference to that, like hell is bad. But actually it's entertaining. It's where people gather and relate to each other. So
it's really interesting thought there. Go ahead, Ray.
I wanted to also, getting back to the Strange Fruit launch, with our first discussion last week at the Food and Arts Collective at Bladdock Hall. When the musician, I think Donald Byrd talked about projections, and how, and I really feel a lot of the characters projecting, like Richard in particular, his kind of dismissing, Rufus as kind of, somehow, a lack of, empathy, I guess. And so I guess Another Country, to me would be this kind of truth within ourselves that may, in some cases, be unexplored, and the characters perhaps can, are reaching or, reaching towards that understanding of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
I did want to talk a little bit about the corporeal sense as home being another country, both metaphorical and literal. We associate another country with another language, an entire world. And so it seems even inhabiting two spaces where you don't feel at home in either one. He also resisted the institution or institutions like religion. He was very theological. I think he was a theologian and a prophet. But in resisting these markers, he doesn't find, there's no, it's always a liminal space. So even in another country, in the corporeal sense that his body is experiencing being within these liminalities and the in-between.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts? To me, we are another country to each other until we figure out how we become our own together. And it doesn't mean it's the same. It can mean anything. It can mean any kind of interpretation of that you want it to mean. But it's ground, if you think of country as ground that you move through, as space you move through, as ways you develop, and therefore become a different person within your own country. You know, there are some wonderful writing that he has when he's writing about Cass talking to Richard and talking to Rufus, that I think begins to reveal a lot of things that are really important in terms of what he's trying to say about the strangers in this world that we're reading about, if you will. Rufus gives up on his life, but yet at the same time, you have Richard who's constantly accusing him of, or trying to come up with ideas like, oh, he gave up, he gave in, he was not brave, he was not strong. Whereas the perception of Rufus and his actions is totally different by everybody else in this world or in this country. Vivaldo himself reveals his inability to feel love, which sends him to see horrors a lot, but then he begins to start to recognize that isn't really what he wants to keep doing, and he has to figure out how is he and what does he want, and it essentially begins the relationship with Ida. There's some phrasing that he writes starting in pages 60 to the 80s, where he talks about the absurdity of people in the space that is around him, which also is very strange to him, such as college boys gleaming with ignorance. Cass tells Rufus, we all commit crimes, but we have to learn to forgive ourselves, or we keep committing the same crimes. Rufus couldn't forgive himself. Rufus couldn't do that. So he jumps. The descriptions of the subway and the passengers is extraordinarily timely. And unfortunately now, sadly so, from everything I read and see about going in the subways, which I avoid at the moment. And then Cass and Richard reveal how they each see women and men from their self point of view, which I thought was extraordinary too. And, you know, going back to one of the points someone made earlier about what's so intriguing is that he's able to look at the white couple, the white man, the Black musician, the sister, the familiar relationships within Rufus's family, and describe them in a way that it's so believable and so clear that you accept it and you start to think and wonder, at least I do, how did they all get to where they got to? How can they all make it through this country they're living in, individually and communally? And I find it even more extraordinary than I did 50-something years ago when I first read it. I also think the key word here that we haven't touched on yet, and we're coming to the end soon, so I want to throw it out here: love. Love is what this is about too. And it's about how differently people want to care, want to be part of, want to connect. So what do you think about that? Yeah. Go ahead.
I think, I mean, personally, I always think about from my point of view, there's a problem when people get to think I want to get loved instead of I want to love. You know, when you want to get love, good luck to us. You know, you might not get it, then you might, you know, in trouble. You might be in trouble when you don't get it. But well, once you think I want to love, then you are more in control, and you are the, yeah, the life you kind of, you are in control of your life. You're not depending on other people's mercy or.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. Alexa?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to say just real quick on that note that oh my gosh, I don't know her name. I'm sorry. That song brought up. I literally just heard an Alan Watts like quote about that. Like I was listening on YouTube and saying that people don't really want to love anybody. They want to control them. Because if you really love somebody, you would be able to kind of just let them do whatever. And people's understanding about love is just is you know, people are these automatrons, and that's not how humanity works. So I'm appreciative that you brought that up some. But the part that got me was when Rufus was at Vivaldo's house and asked him, like, have you ever thought about being gay? Because he was just saying, like, I don't understand this relationship life. Like just, it's because it was so easy for him to be vulnerable and not understanding that that vulnerability was possible with this woman. And he was beating her up because he wasn't able to disassociate her race and her gender and her willingness to love him from like his like inability to do that for her. Like it was like he had all these identities and she was like, it doesn't matter. And he was taking it as like dismissive rather than her saying like, no, I'm seeing you as a human being. I understand that those are things that are, you know, make you up, but I feel like if you were able to separate yourself, at least when you're with me, even though she calls him boy, which was like, I don't like, if you can't separate that and see why that would make somebody feel uncomfortable while you're with them. Okay. But I feel like in those moments, like he was desperately trying to find love from people, but was just like, and maybe that's why he fell into because I only got halfway, like after he, you know, committed suicide is pretty much where I was at the end of the book. That was the end of me being able to read, but it felt like that was the torture for him. Like he was like, I want to be with a woman and I want to have, you know, a family and kids. I want to be normal, but for normal for me, quote unquote, right? But normal for me is to love a man, and I can be tender with a man because that feels comfortable, and not understanding that may have been, you know, his bag, you know, that he might have been gay and just been forcing it all the time because he didn't understand like the nuance. Because I and I'll just end it there because I don't want to take up too much time, but I just feel like that was actually one of the unrealistic conversations that I thought they were having, or tenderness that they had when he asked him that. I'm like, I don't know any man who would say that to another man, at least right now. Have you ever thought about being with a man? But I know plenty of women who have had that conversation with other women. So yeah, I'll leave that there.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. And I think your insights are sharp and right on in terms of what you gathered from that whole thing. So they're all exploring how they want to be, with each other. And we're kind of at the end here, so I'm going to just read you a brief segment and then ask you for any additional comments. But in the section which focuses on the relationships between Vivaldo and Ida and Richard and Cass, there are a couple of sentences that he wrote in there that I thought were just incredibly important to think about. And it goes like this: the occurrence of an event is not the same thing as knowing what it is that one has lived through. Most people had not lived, nor could it for that matter be said that they had died through any of their terrible events. They had simply been stunned by the hammer. They passed their lives thereafter in a kind of limbo of denied and unexamined pain. And Vivaldo asks himself, had he ever been present in his life? Any thoughts about that? Yep. Yep.
I feel the same like Vivaldo, like especially when I'm not mindful, just doing things out of habit or in a hurry.
Mm-hmm.
So I think being mindful is kind of important to feel like you live the life among others.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the character Vivaldo. It's kind of vulnerable in many ways. Also, I want to kind of share that I love the how James Baldwin wrote about the suicide. That's beautifully written, I think.
Yeah. Extraordinarily dramatic and extraordinarily, obviously, final.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, it brought up for me the release that Rufus needed. He just couldn't take it anymore.
On that note, Carole, we just want to thank you so much for leading this conversation. Ray, do you still want to have everyone introduce themselves, or those who want to, at least? Because we kind of introduced ourselves, as we were speaking. So
I might suggest that we start off with that next time.
sounds good.
Just because
Sounds
it's
good.
8:30 and
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
I just want to thank everyone who came this week. Thanks Ray Pultinas from the James Baldwin Outdoor Learning Center. Carole led a really engaging conversation. We're going to meet the same time next week, 7 o'clock. We're discussing pages or book 2, which are pages 183 to 267. If you have any questions or any issues throughout the week, feel free to email me. If you want to reach out to Carole, let's see if I can find your email. I know you sent it to me, Carole.
Well, I'll tell you, it's simple. It's my name, but don't forget the E in Carole. A lot of people do. So Carole Weinstein, all one word, at msn.com. And I encourage you to do that. Send me a note, tell me a thought, anything more that you want to throw out for us to talk about next week, that would be helpful as well. So participate in any way that you think you would like that helps you have the best you can out of our conversations together. And I can't thank you all enough for being here, participating, and taking the time to care about all this.
Thank you, Carol. So this is how the book club works. It's definitely about the book, but it's as much about what you bring to the conversation. So as you can see, we talked about the book, but every statement wasn't particularly about the book. We brought in our own life experiences, we brought in history, we brought in other books, and that's how this book club works. I hope you all return next week, same time, 7 o'clock. Tell a friend. As you can see, it's Zoom, so we have plenty space for everyone. Again, if you have any questions, you can email Carol. You can email me through the e-blast that you received. And again, have a good night. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next week.